In our text today, Jesus is being questioned by the disciples of John the Baptist and the Pharisees about the fasting habits of his followers. In the first century context, religious leaders believed that righteousness demanded strict fasting 2 days a week. So their question for Jesus is, if your disciples are striving toward righteousness, why aren't they fasting? However, the Pharisees missed the point of this spiritual discipline. Jesus' disciples didn't need to fast because its purpose was obsolete in Christ's presence. Now, I think for many of us, we might miss the purpose of fasting too. Maybe you've never thought about fasting before, let alone why it's even a spiritual practice. Or perhaps you've done a 24-hour fast to raise money to youth group, or you've tried intermittent fasting to shed some holiday pounds. Or maybe you've done what I used to do, and you fasted because there's something that you want God to do for you. Concerning how Christians typically fast, John Calvin writes, "Believers will often say that they either don't need to fast because they have the Spirit of God, or they will fast because they believe they can control God. But both of these are wrong." So let's look at these tendencies and discover God's intention behind this spiritual discipline. A biblical fast is to abstain from food for a spiritual reason. Sometimes we might say we're fasting from social media or television or alcohol, and while these are good things to abstain from, biblical fast is not actually one of these. A biblical fast is taking a break from life-giving, body-sustaining food for a spiritual reason. It's refraining from a good thing for the sake of a better thing. And while we don't need to do this, it's a tool that forms us in our walk with Christ. One of the main things fasting does for us is it reminds us of our need. In our culture of abundance, this is challenging when we're constantly surrounded by plenty. But as Christians, we know that we're in constant need of God's strength, presence, and grace. So what fasting does is it connects the needs of our body to the needs of our soul. It creates an appetite for dependence on God by physically experiencing hunger pains of our stomach. It's starving the flesh to feed the spirit. So while we do have the Spirit of God in us as born-again believers, fasting is a discipline we do that rebels against our narrative of our culture that says there's something greater than food that's only available in closeness with Christ. And fasting is meant to be difficult. In the experience of hunger pain, our spirits are formed. It reminds us of our great need in Christ. That's the first reason we fast, to be spiritually formed and reminded of our need. The second purpose for fasting is connected to our requests of God. But as Calvin noted earlier, fasting is not meant for us to control God, mainly because we can't control God. Ephesians 1:11 is clear that God works all things together according to the counsel of His will. However, fasting is a physical demonstration of the pleas of our hearts. Often, fasting is done in parallel with prayer requests. When someone is sick, experiencing a loss, or we're pleading for God to show up, fasting is a demonstration of our earnestness. It's not that if we fast, God will honor our discipline and do what we want, but it's an expression of our petitions. It's saying, just as my soul is longing for God to do this thing, so will my body. John Piper says fasting is an exclamation point at the end of our pleas to God. Fasting demonstrates the requests of our hearts by bringing every aspect of our lives into alignment, both body and spirit. So the time we used to spend eating, there's now room for prayer. It's a painful reminder of the empty stomach that reminds us of our request and the spiritual angst that we have for God to show up. Fasting is a beautiful spiritual discipline that connects our spiritual lives to our physical lives. It forms us in our relationship with Christ by reminding us of the needs expressed in their sincerity and desperation. So, I want to encourage you today to integrate fasting into your spiritual rhythms and learn to love this beautiful, ancient way of growing closer to God. As Charles Spurgeon once wrote, "Seasons of fasting and prayer in the tabernacle have been the high days indeed. Never has heaven gates been stood wider, and never have our hearts been nearer to His glory."